Bobby Clarke's teeth were missing, his smile was crooked, but don't let that fool you. Standing at just 5 feet 10 inches and weighing 185 pounds, he wasn't the biggest guy on the ice, but he was one of the meanest. This kid from a small Canadian town was told he would never make it in hockey because he had diabetes. Back then, people thought diabetics couldn't be athletes, but Clarke didn't just prove them wrong. He changed hockey forever. He led the Philadelphia Flyers to 2 Stanley Cups, won 3 MVP awards, and scored over 1,148 points in his career. And he did it all while having to check his blood sugar between periods and take insulin shots before games. He wasn't just tough on the ice, his whole life was about being tough. That's what made Bobby Clarke more than just a hockey player. He was the heart and soul of Philadelphia sports. The Philadelphia Flyers were a mess before Bobby Clarke. In their first 4 years, they never finished higher than 3rd place in their division and only won 76 out of 288 games. That's like winning just 1 game out of every 4. Their attendance was so bad that people joked about being able to hear individual conversations in the arena. But everything changed in 1969 when they drafted a kid named Bobby Clarke. Most teams passed on him because he had diabetes. Doctors back then thought diabetics couldn't play professional sports. The Flyers took a chance on him with their 2nd-round pick, even though he was clearly 1st-round talent. In junior hockey, Clarke had scored an incredible 151 points in just 58 games. That's almost 3 points per game. But his diabetes was so bad that he'd sometimes pass out during games. He'd wake up, drink some orange juice, and go right back to playing. The team doctors told him to quit hockey, but Clarke refused. Instead, he learned to manage his blood sugar by eating chocolate bars between periods. In this video, we'll see how this teenager who doctors said would never make it became one of hockey's greatest leaders and turned one of the worst teams into champions. Every morning, Clarke had to prick his finger to test his blood sugar, then give himself an insulin shot, just to get out of bed and start his day. Back in the 1960s, this wasn't as simple as it is today. The needles were thick, painful, and had to be boiled before each use. Clarke had to do this twice a day, every day, no matter what. Growing up in Flin Flon, a tiny mining town in Manitoba, Canada, young Bobby didn't have much. His father was a miner who worked deep underground, and his mother cleaned other people's houses. But what they did have was an outdoor rink just steps from their front door. Even in temperatures as low as minus 40 degrees, Clarke would be out there skating. The doctors had told him hockey was impossible with diabetes. In the 1960s, many people with diabetes were told not to exercise at all, but Clarke found a way. He kept candy bars in his hockey pants and would eat them between periods to keep his blood sugar up. His mother would watch every game from the stands, ready to run down with orange juice if he started looking pale. At age 12, Clarke was already better than kids 4 years older than him, but scouts ignored him because of his diabetes. One scout even said, "It's a shame about the diabetes. He would have made it to the NHL." Clarke used these words as fuel. He started practicing twice as hard as everyone else, often staying on the ice until his fingers went numb from the cold. In his final year of junior hockey, Clarke scored an incredible 137 points in just 55 games. Still, NHL teams were scared to draft him. The Philadelphia Flyers scout, though, saw something special. He noticed that Clarke never missed a game despite his diabetes. In fact, Clarke was usually the last player to leave practice. The most impressive part? Clarke kept his diabetes a secret from almost everyone. He didn't want people to feel sorry for him or use it as an excuse to keep him off the ice. What made Clarke different was his mix of skill and pure meanness on the ice. When other players would back down from bigger opponents, Clarke would skate right at them with his famous gap-toothed grin. His missing front teeth weren't from a hockey fight. They rotted from diabetes, but that smile became the scariest sight in hockey. In 1973, the Flyers made Clarke their captain. He was just 23, but something changed in Philadelphia's locker room. If a player showed up even 1 minute late to practice, Clarke would stare them down and say, "That's not how we do things here." Soon, the Flyers became the most on-time team in the NHL. Clarke created a new kind of hockey team. He told his teammates, if someone hits you, hit them twice as hard. If they do it again, hit them 3 times as hard. The Flyers became known as the Broad Street Bullies, and Clarke was their leader. But what many fans didn't know was that Clarke was usually the first player at practice and the last to leave. While other stars would rest during optional skates, Clarke never missed one. In 1974, during Game 2 of the Stanley Cup Finals against Boston, Clarke showed what made him special. The Flyers were huge underdogs. The Bruins had Bobby Orr and Phil Esposito. They were supposed to easily win. But in overtime, Clarke stole the puck, raced down the ice, and scored the winning goal. The Flyers' equipment manager later said he found Clarke in the locker room after the game, giving himself an insulin shot with shaking hands, completely exhausted, but still grinning. That same year, when the Flyers played against the Soviet Red Army team, considered the best team in the world, Clarke did something that shocked everyone. Early in the game, he slashed the ankle of their best player, Valery Kharlamov. Many called it a dirty play, but Clarke said, "They came to our rink thinking they were better than us. I had to show them they weren't." The Flyers won 4-1 and became the first NHL team to beat the Soviets. What really set Clarke apart was how he turned the Flyers into a family. If a teammate was struggling with bills, Clarke would quietly help them out. If someone's wife was sick, Clarke would be the first to visit the hospital. He wasn't just tough on the ice, he protected his own. Before Clarke, hockey teams saw players with health problems as too risky to draft. After him, teams started looking at a player's heart and determination more than their medical charts. Today, there are several NHL players with diabetes, and they all point to Clarke as the guy who opened the door for them. Before Clarke, NHL captains were usually the most skilled players or the oldest veterans. After him, teams started looking for leaders who would do anything to win, even if that meant being the bad guy. Clarke showed that a captain's most important job wasn't scoring goals, but making everyone around them better. Before Clarke's Flyers, hockey was known as a gentleman's game in North America. After his Broad Street Bullies, the sport became tougher, more physical, and teams started building rosters not just for skill, but for toughness. The Flyers' style worked so well that even teams that hated them started copying them. Before Clarke, players with missing teeth would get them fixed right away to look more professional. After Clarke, that gapped-tooth grin became a badge of honor in hockey. Even today, many players wait until retirement to fix their teeth, wearing their missing teeth like a warrior's scars. But Clarke's biggest impact wasn't just about being tough. In his final years as a player, he started carrying around a notepad, writing down plays and strategies. After retiring, he became one of hockey's smartest executives. He built Team Canada's 2002 Olympic gold medal team and showed that even the toughest players can also be the smartest. Today, coaches still use Clarke as an example of perfect two-way hockey, playing great on both offense and defense. In his best season, Clarke scored 119 points while also being one of the best defensive forwards in the game. He proved you didn't have to choose between being skilled or being tough. You could be both. Most importantly, before Clarke, athletes with chronic illnesses were told what they couldn't do. After Clarke, they were inspired by what they could do. Max Domi, a current NHL player with diabetes, keeps a picture of Clarke in his locker. He says, "Every time a doctor tells me to be careful because of my diabetes, I look at that picture and remember, Clarke didn't just play, he dominated." Yes, Bobby Clarke was a dirty player sometimes. That slash on Kharlamov's ankle, the fights, the brutal checks, they're all part of his story. Some people will never forgive him for those moments. But hockey was different back then, and Clarke did whatever it took to win. What's amazing is that while some players are remembered just for being tough or just for being skilled, Clarke is remembered for being everything. He won 3 MVP awards, 2 Stanley Cups, and made 8 first All-Star teams, all while checking his blood sugar between periods and taking insulin shots in locker rooms. Today, when a young athlete is told they can't play because of a health condition, they point to Bobby Clarke. When a smaller player is told they're not tough enough, they point to Bobby Clarke. And when someone says you have to choose between being skilled or being tough, they point to Bobby Clarke. Maybe that's his real legacy, not the cups, not the fights, not even the famous grin. It's the simple message his career sent to everyone. Don't let anyone tell you what you can't do. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video about one of hockey's most interesting players, hit subscribe and check out our other videos about sports legends who changed their games forever.